Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS legal hotline lawyer, and today is the fourth video in our Form 22B Home Sale Contingency series.
Yes.
And in the last video, we talked about the bump period from seller's perspective. In this video, let's talk about the bump period from buyer's perspective.
Okay.
But let's start for a second back at paragraph 1. And I know we've talked about paragraph 1, but I want to make sure that everybody understands that paragraph 1 establishes the contingency time period itself. Not the bump period. We talked about the bump period in the last video. The contingency time period itself. So paragraph 1 by default says that buyer's home sale contingency period is 45 days. So you can make that more, you can make it less. It's 45 days by default. And that means that buyer has 45 days to sell buyer's home. And if they are unable to sell their home within those 45 days, then they have a legal excuse for terminating the transaction with seller. So it's a contingency period. It lets them out of the purchase agreement with seller if they're unable to sell their home.
Yeah, and when we say sell, we don't want to get confused with this form, because in this case, 45 days to sell your home means 45 days to go under contract.
Oh, good point.
Not close, but go under
Good
contract. Point. So it can be confusing the way it's written. So I just wanted to make sure we understood that.
Okay, so 45 days to get to mutual acceptance on the sale of their home, not
Yes.
to close the sale
Correct.
of their home. Agreed. Okay, unless you get a bump notice along the way.
Could
right?
get a bump notice.
Okay, so if you get a bump notice, and by the way, listing brokers, if you're going to deliver a bump notice, it's Form 44. Buyer brokers, if you receive a bump notice, you're going to respond to seller on Form 46. And so when buyer receives a bump notice, they've got exactly 4 options, right? They can give notice that they have, in fact, already sold their home.
Got under contract.
Right? They can give notice that they are unable to sell their home. They can give notice that they, well, I guess this is really part of the first one. I was about to say they can get lucky and sell their home, but that would be just that they're giving notice that they've sold their home. And so really their third/4th option is to waive their home sale contingency. And that is a big deal. And so buyer brokers, before your buyer ever enters a home sale contingency transaction, your buyer needs to be aware of what it means to waive the home sale contingency addendum. I'm sorry, home sale contingency. So, Ken?
Yes.
What happens if buyer waives their home sale contingency?
Okay, so if the buyer decides to waive the home sale contingency, what the 22B says is they also waive everything else. This is in paragraph 6 on the second page. They waive everything else. They waive their financing addendum, everything, and they agree to close in 30 days. That's what that means by waiving. I waive everything, and I'm going to close in 30 days.
Buyer waives a home sale contingency. Buyer also waives, necessarily, financing contingency, inspection contingency,
everything,
title review contingency, anything that could possibly give buyer a legal excuse for terminating the transaction. Buyer waives when they waive the home sale contingency, and they agree to close in 30 days. That's a big consequence.
That's huge.
Sometimes people ask me, why do buyers have to waive all of that stuff just to waive their home sale contingency addendum? And buyer brokers, I think it's helpful if you can explain to your buyer why that consequence comes. Because understand, seller, if your buyer waives, let me back up. Your buyer entered an agreement with the seller saying to the seller, hey seller, I'd love to buy your house, but I can't buy your house unless I first sell my house. I can only buy your house if I first sell my house. And then seller gives you a bump notice because seller's got another buyer that they'd rather sell to. Yep. That's the whole reason you got a bump notice, is because they've got a buyer they'd rather sell to. And now, just like that, magically, you can buy their house without first selling your house. So you're going to make the seller chase away the buyer that they want to sell to in order to put you back in the driver's seat as the buyer. And so buyer, if you're going to do that, if you're going to tell the seller one day that you have to sell your home before you can buy their home, and now all of a sudden, nope, just kidding, I really can buy, then you got to put your money where your mouth is at that point, which is why you have to waive all contingencies and close in 30 days.
Yep.
So I think that brings us to an interesting discussion, which is, tell me about the timeline for a home sale contingency buyer to conduct inspections, and to apply for financing.
Okay, well, let's first talk about inspections. This comes up all the time. So a contingent buyer goes under contract with a 22B. I always ask the question, when does the inspection period start if we indeed have an inspection addendum in the contract? When does that inspection period start? Does it start when we have mutual acceptance with the 22B contingent buyer and the seller, or does it start when the 22B contingent buyer has a mutually accepted contract on their house? I ask that question all the time, and I always split the room down the middle on the answer. So when does it start? It starts, do you want me to answer it?
Go for it.
It starts when we have mutual acceptance on the subject house and the 22B buyer. That's when it starts, not when we have mutual acceptance on the contingent house.
And then people will ask me sometimes in class, well, why is that? Why should I have to do an inspection on a home that I might not even want to buy?
All the time.
And the answer to that question is also really simple if you think about it. Buyers, you're holding sellers' home off the market, mostly, or you've really created an obstacle, at least for the seller, to be able to sell their home to another buyer. So let's just to say effectively, you're taking the seller's home off the market so that you can sell your home. Now, let's say that it takes you 40 days to sell your home, and then you give notice to the seller that you've sold your home, and so now I'm going to do my inspection contingency? I'm sorry, now I'm going to do my inspection? What if you do your inspection and you decide, I don't want to buy seller's house after all? Sorry! Thanks for letting me have 50 days of your life. Nope, doesn't work that way.
Doesn't make sense.
Yeah. So, buyers, you have to do your inspections. Your inspection contingency is going to be deemed waived if it's a 10-day inspection contingency, 10 days following mutual acceptance of buyer's agreement with seller, having nothing to do with whether buyer ever sells their home or not. And then buyer, if you want to terminate the agreement with seller based on the inspection contingency, let seller go find another buyer.
Sure.
Take them and get rid of the home sale contingency.
Yeah, that only makes sense.
Yeah. So Ken, if that's true of the inspection contingency, what about the financing contingency? Is buyer required to make loan application for their financing at the time of mutual acceptance between seller and buyer?
So that's controlled in paragraph 3 in the 22B. So there is a choice to be made as far as when do those time periods to make application, when do those time periods start? Do they start when we have mutual acceptance with the subject property and the 22B buyer? Or does it start when we have the 22B buyer's house going under contract with another buyer?
Okay.
When does that start?
So you have the discretion to make that decision.
Yes.
Does it make sense to delay buyer's loan application until buyer has sold their home?
I don't see the sense in it. It makes no sense to me.
Okay.
I mean, because the buyer, the seller's house, the subject house is now in a contingent status on the market, and we want to know, can buyer perform? And if we haven't even started the application process yet, and we're not doing it until the contingent house goes under contract, and they have 45 days to do that, and if that happens in 40 days, now we're going to start the loan application process?
Okay, all of that, I agree with you. And then also, what about, so we've talked about if the buyer waives their home sale contingency, they waive all other contingencies. I don't think we yet mentioned that in addition to waiving all home sale contingencies, they also then have to
Close in 30 days.
Close in 30 days from the date of waiver. So if they haven't started their loan application yet, and then they have to close 30 days later, and they haven't sold their home yet, that means that they're probably going to be applying for a bridge loan. No way are you getting a bridge loan in 30 days. It's not going to happen. So buyer brokers, my suggestion, although the form gives you the platform for negotiating it, my suggestion is that you encourage your buyer to make loan application immediately. And if that means that they're making 2 loan applications, they make a bridge loan application in case they have to go that direction, or they make a conventional or FHA, whatever they were planning on making, assuming they sold their property and had those funds, then they make that loan application also, get them to the lender and get that process started.
Right, you really could be setting the buyer up for a default if you say we don't make that application until the contingent house goes under contract. You're setting them up for failure.
Okay. All right. So we've talked about seller delivering the bump notice on Form 44, buyer responding to the bump notice on Form 46, and I think we've outlined all of the options that the buyer can consume there. Another notice form we haven't talked about is 90K. So what if the buyer never receives a bump notice but is still able to sell their home? They have to give notice to the seller, right?
Well, there's a lot of different triggers where you'd have to give notice. So if our house goes under contract.
So buyer enters an agreement with buyer's buyer.
The contingent house goes under contract.
Okay.
Well, what if that house then falls out of contract?
Wait a minute. Let's just start with that one.
Okay.
So if the buyer sells their home to buyer's buyer, no bump notice received. We just have buyer selling their contingent home.
Yes.
Buyer has to deliver a notice to the buyer's seller, and it would be on Form 90K. You have, I think, two days, right?
I'd have to look.
I think it's 2 days.
Which I would look in real life.
In real life, we'll look, but I'm pretty sure it's 2 days to deliver the 90K notice that the contingent home is sold. And when you deliver that notice, what else do you have to deliver?
A copy of the entire contract.
The contract between buyer and buyer's buyer.
That one.
That has to be delivered. And that's really critical because it takes us back to paragraph 2 of Form 22B, where the contract between buyer and buyer's buyer can't have a closing date of less than 30 or more than 60 days.
And can't be contingent on another buyer's contingent properties.
Home sale or pending sale contingency. And we talked about that in the second video. Mm-hmm. We didn't in that video mention the notice form that you use if buyer does need to get seller's permission for this transaction over here. It's Form 90L. So that's the form that buyer would send to seller asking for permission to change to get outside the closing windows, or the home sale or pending sale contingency status. Okay, so then back to the notices that buyer is going to deliver to seller. We've got the notice that buyer has sold their home. What else?
We've satisfied the contingency. What if we satisfied the contingency and then that house falls out of contract?
Is there a notice for that?
It's the same notice.
90K. It's the same exact notice.
90K has a bunch of different notices on there for all the different things that can happen with that.
Can we tell the buyer brokers, please, what you never, and listing brokers too, because I've seen both brokers on both sides of the transaction make this mistake. When the buyer's home sells, so buyer sells to buyer's buyer, and you deliver the 90K to seller, putting them on notice, and you deliver a copy of the transaction to the seller, putting them on notice, you never, ever include what form in a 22B transaction?
Oh, 22Q.
Pending sale contingency.
No.
Never.
They never cross paths.
22B and 22Q are not friends. They should never be in the same transaction together.
I see it all the time, and I know you probably hear about it all the time.
And there's a huge reason why. Talking about the totality of the offer. One thing we haven't talked about yet. What is maybe we did actually in the very first video. How do we determine the closing date of the transaction when 22B is involved?
Okay. So we have a mutually accepted contract with a 22B. When is the close date for the subject house?
Right.
Is the question. Is it what's on page
No,
one?
No, we want. Just tell them.
Oh.
Just tell them. Because I want to cut to the chase.
The close date is going to be 3 days after the close of the contingent house.
Or 30 days after buyer waives, right?
Or 30 days after buyer waives.
So whether buyer sells their home or waives their home sale contingency, Form 22B controls the closing date of the transaction,
Completely.
Right? Has nothing to do with the face of Form 21.
Right.
In fact, what you tell brokers to write what on the face of Form 21, on the closing date provision?
Right. So on page 1, Form 21, closing date, I tell people and I write see Form 22B.
That's great. I have no problem with that. That makes sense to me. Okay, so that's 22B. Now, why are we talking about that at the same time we're talking about 22Q?
I didn't even want to bring up Q because I don't want people to cross paths.
If you have a 22Q in your transaction, the closing date of the transaction is the date established on the face of Form 21. And so now all of a sudden we have conflicting closing dates. Form 22B controls a closing date based on the
Closing
the transaction or the waiver of the transaction, or the waiver of the home sale contingency. 22Q says that we close based on the date provided on the face of Form 21.
Page 121.
Now, if somebody's written, this just all of a sudden dawned on me while I was talking, if the if the parties have written C Form 22B on the face of Form 21 and the 22Q is entered in the transaction and it circles you back, anyhow, don't
use
do it.
22Q.
Just don't do it. 22Q should never be in a 22B transaction.
No, never.
Okay. I'm not sure we can say anything more about this at this point.
Okay, I'm with you.
I think we call it here. I do have one more thing that I think is important to talk about with respect to Form 22B, so I do not want you all to go away for too far or too long. Instead, between now and the next video, if you have any questions, send them to me, legal hotline at warealtor.org. I promise not to be quite as silly in answering your questions as we've been in the last 2 minutes of this video. But in any event, thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.